use the word emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 351.AC2830, certificate number 25380. Dingbat Apartments.
I used to live in a two-room apartment, neighbors knocking on my wall.
So we have talked quite a bit about mid-century architecture and culture and things on this program, and it's not just because I recently bought a house that was built in 1953.
I feel like it's the other way around. You bought that house because you're interested in the period.
Yeah, and it was not a period that I grew up being interested in, because when I was a kid in the 70s, all that 1955 stuff was just exactly in the sweet spot of like, this is old, dusty, and not kept up.
I used to like looking at my parents' old like elementary school readers where you could see Dick and Jane with their freshly ironed clothes, having freshly scrubbed adventures. And even though it was only 20 years old, it just seemed like another planet that was hilarious. Like, look, they have chums, you know? So I can totally see that about fashion as well. Like, you want shag carpeting and waterbeds.
Right. And but it has gone through a period of like, where its fashionability was you watch these things become so unfashionable that they're absolutely like examples of the worst possible taste, the kind of thing that and then they go through a period where they're ironic. They're so bad they're ironic, and then when the irony wears off, then they just go back to being terrible.
We've landed on thinking that this mid-century stuff was actually good. And is that because it was inherently good all along once we lost all our associations with it?
Well, the thing about mid-century everything is that just like Victoriana, that term encompasses the entire breadth from the crappiest, cheapest prefabricated stuff to the nicest and most expensive and custom stuff. I mean, Queen Victoria was responsible for a period of amazing architecture, but also for the Boer Wars. So, that
doesn't count as architecture per se. I don't want to buy a house that reminds everyone of the Boer Wars.
But the thing about the mid-century
I'm just wondering if you think some periods are actually inherently better than others, and that's why they kind of emerge as evergreen and some do not.
So much gets lumped into this because what is mid-century as a descriptor other than to say everything built between 1945 and 1965 or 68?
Let me just say one thing before you get into this.
Jump in.
I'm a little bit younger than you, so I have the experience of thinking all these 70s signifiers are just laughable.
Yeah.
Watching Barney Miller reruns and just laughing at their wide ties and everything. But I had the experience of watching, I watched Network this week, which I hadn't looked at in a long time.
Did it make you mad as hell?
Oh, I'm not going to take it anymore. You know what made me want to watch it? I was watching Out of Sight, the Soderbergh movie.
Yeah,
it's
the great
fantastic.
Soderbergh movie.
Elmore Leonard. And there's a part where it's the famous scene where George Clooney's in the car trunk with J-Lo, and he misquotes the Network scene. He says, remember when Peter Finch gets up there and he says, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take any more of this shit. And he's so happy that he remembers the line that she doesn't correct him. But I'm watching this movie set in, what I would have thought of as the most laughable fashions of the time just before me, because every generation hates the fashions from right before them.
Right,
because
you have to think.
It's recent enough for you to know that they existed, but also to know that they're the opposite of what's cool now.
Right.
And I'm watching, and I'm realizing that the 70s fashions are great. They have emerged in there now. The more outrageous, the better. But the hair has not. Like the hair, I think, was objectively terrible, and it was blinding us to how good the fashion was for the next 20 years. If those
Are you
people
talking
had
about the dry look? The like very hairsprayed kind of like Robert Redford, like dry combed.
a lot of it is sheer volume of hair.
I see.
The ridiculous volume of the sideburns.
You're saying this to me now in my COVID quarantine hair.
But just clean-shaven men with just unruly hair, piles of it cascading everywhere over their shirt collar.
Yeah, that is bad.
There's just no excuse for it.
But I'm interested to hear you say that you think the fashion is cool. The giant collars and the polyester
Looks amazing now. Like I'm not gonna wear it because it would look like a party dress. But if you saw somebody in that, you would be like, "What an amazing look!
Yeah.
Good for you."
Yeah, and maybe it is that it's one thing for it to be singled out now in a sea of conformity, and another thing when everybody was dressing like that, where it was like, whoa.
And it was a race to the most ridiculous plaid pants. And
I think that's what's interesting about mid-century architecture now. Like everything, a lot of it's been destroyed or lost. A lot of it when you think about Seattle in the 1980s, and you remember Aurora Boulevard, and every city in America has a town like, or a street like this.
A strip like that. Yeah.
Where it was before the freeways were built, it was the main road in and out of town. And during this period, the post-war period, it was where all the new motels were built, the streamlined modern first, and then the mid-century, the Googie architecture, which we'll talk about on this show. All the kind of space-age, tiki-influenced architecture of that time. And those motels were the coolest thing in the 50s and 60s. And then by the 70s, they had fallen into kind of disrepair, and then those streets became sort of centers for prostitution and drug dealing. Those motels.
The motels are perfect for that.
Yeah. They all turned into like motel rooms by the hour. Mm-hmm. And then we watched, just in the time that we've lived in Seattle as grown-ups, watch those motels one by one get torn down and replaced either by cookie cutter box apartments or just vacant lots, such that what was once a real parade of vernacular architecture is now almost completely gone. Just in 15 years. There was a time you could probably buy a motel on Aurora for $200,000. Now they're gone completely, and the ones that do remain, you look at them and go, oh, how could we ever? And they're not even the good ones that remain, right? They're just the regular, just one called the Palms or whatever.
You should have bought one.
Down here on International Boulevard outside of the airport here in SeaTac, they just have torn down all of the old motels. And of course, those were the Green River Killer motels. So maybe not so bad that they're gone. But
well, you can request a different room.
I suppose.
By Washington state law, if you get placed in one of the Green River Killer rooms.
But when I think about my house and what appeals to me about it is that there aren't that many left that are intact, you know?
So it's the rarity that increases the legitimacy. That's interesting.
When you see somebody in a funky 70s outfit, part of what makes it look fantastic is...
It survived.
Yeah, it survived and it's rare. But mid-century architecture at its loftiest was accompanied by a whole philosophy of living. And those were expensive homes to build. And it was we talk about it all the time, where you have to be a certain amount of rich to afford to live in austere conditions. And mid-century architecture was kind of without adornment. That was the principle of it. It didn't have a lot of gewgaws. It was streamlined, and it was simplifying.
A house is a machine for living in.
That's right. And it simplified your mind in a way that you didn't have to look at so many gilded mirrors.
Because there's no purpose to them. So it's dishonest somehow.
Right. Right, that's right. It's don't dress it up. Just leave the ultimate sort of Bauhaus exposure of all the conduits.
Yeah, if you agree that both things, if you can come around to the idea that both things are equally beautiful,
form follows function.
Then what you want is the house that has exactly the things you want in a house and none of the extra corners or ornaments.
But at its worst, you can take that mentality and use it to justify building completely uninspired, cheap, square, mass-produced buildings.
Because it is cheaper. Like once you strip away ornamentation, that kind of complexity costs money.
Well, but that's the amazing thing about truly great mid-century architecture is it's deceptively more expensive to build because all those lines, all those, if you talk to any builder, you realize that a wall of glass is much more expensive than a wall of wood because just to make that many windows, each window is 3 times the cost of wood and stucco by square inch, by square foot. And so those houses that seem like they're hardly there, they're just made of gossamer.
And the workmanship's probably better too. You can't hide, being a millimeter off.
That's right. It has to be. Also impossible to insulate those buildings because the ceilings, are lofted and then the roofs are flat. There are no attics. There's no crawl space. There's no place to hide the the elements that in a typical box house you just throw them, the electricity, the stuff, you just throw it in the walls, it's all hanging
Where
there.
does Philip Johnson even pee in his glass box?
Right? I mean, where is there
where's his water heater?
Yeah, how do you build a shower? Right, exactly. Where's the breaker box, And all that stuff, you have to build it so much more sensitively in truly great mid-century architecture. I learned this from my friend Ben King, who is an architect my age, but who studied with a lot of the architects that grew up in, like, studying with the masters. And he just talks about how difficult it is if the roof of your house is only 6 inches deep. How do you make it so that the house isn't cold and drafty and baking hot in the summer? It's it's an industrial design too.
And we've probably gotten more picky about that stuff as time has gone on. We expect to have incredible control over our comfort in a way that the people of the 1950s even would have expected drafts.
We do, and what we settle for is vinyl double or triple pane windows that look terrible and are hard to interact with, but they keep the heat in. We have central air, we have lights on dimmers, we have all these all-mod cons that give us the illusion of luxury because we do have control over our environment. But what we don't have is anything in a typically constructed modern house. There's nothing nice about it. The luxury is all stapled on, and there's no thought really put into the design. It's just about square footage. The wonderful mid-century homes are all really actually surprisingly small in their dimensions because the idea is that you not, lumber around your oversized house, sitting at your vanity and mom has an office, dad has an office. Those houses were meant to be lived in with a kind of austerity of spirit.
Yeah, is that the idea that it's kind of showy, that it's showy to have too much stuff, or is it just, this is by our standards, this is a pretty big house, so it's the right amount of showiness. It's just the goalposts keep moving.
I think there, if you talk about architecture or art or design or fashion with any kind of philosophical underpinning, you get very quickly to the idea that your environment, that the aesthetics of the things around you are going to have an effect on your virtue or lack thereof. That the house is going to inspire you to think more clearly. The style is going to pare away the confusion and clutter in your mind, and you will have a kind of like the austerity of the setting will bring peace.
I do find that I'm happier in a room that looks good and not one where I'm constantly troubled by, I never liked that shelf. I never liked where that window is, but I'm not sure if it's actually any kind of inner peace, or if it's just kind of the self-congratulation of, I did it. I got a room to my specifications, and that's what winners do.
I wonder how different it is within this idea, right? And it is a modern concept that, because really to buy a mid-century modern house is consumerism in its finest.
Yeah.
To have a house that only has one perfect thing on every shelf is to still be convinced there is a perfect thing. But also a house that's made out of windows is hopefully not situated over a freeway on-ramp. Those windows are inviting in your beautifully landscaped garden as well. But as this style started to, as it was translated into the mid-economic strata and then the widespread, because this was a period in America of tremendous growth. Suburbs, people coming back from the war, a baby boom, people wanting to buy a new house.
Lots of new building.
New
construction.
And so all of that building wasn't going to be...
It can't all be high quality.
It can't all be high quality. And as it started to filter down, you got the austerity, but the austerity became a byword for cheap and square. It's much harder to build something with a curve than with a square. And if your style is square, hey, what a boon to builders and property owners to build a square box with square windows and square stairs and square lights. It all fits. It all packs nicely in a box and packs nicely in the back of a truck.
It'll arrive in a kit.
Yeah. So by the early 50s, the mid 50s, there, especially in major cities and cities that were experiencing rapid growth, like Los Angeles, San Francisco,
crazy to
suburbs of New York.
Crazy to think how long Los Angeles is just a tiny little city. I mean,
and Los Angeles
Seattle was the second biggest city on the U.S. Pacific coast, well into the 20th century. San Francisco, then Seattle.
Isn't that incredible?
Because L.A. was just a little cow town in an orchard grove.
And L.A., the vernacular architecture that was native to there was the L.A. bungalow and a lot of sort of Spanish
mission influenced
mission stuff, but also just the classic turn of the last century bungalow, small sort of hip roofed, maybe 2 rooms upstairs and 2 bedrooms downstairs. A pretty humble neighborhood after neighborhood of these little houses. And with the rise of Hollywood and then post-war LA just boom times, in an attempt to bring density into those neighborhoods, there was a lot of tearing down of 2-bedroom bungalows and replacing them with apartment buildings, so that if you were a property owner that had a 2-bedroom bungalow but could replace it with a building that had 6 apartments in it, it made a real difference to your income. And there were a lot of people moving to LA, Seattle, New York, San Francisco. Las Vegas was a town invented completely out of whole cloth during this period. But all of these towns had people moving in who were part of a service economy, people who weren't in a position to buy a house and live there for 30 years, but wanted an apartment because they were working as a waiter trying to get into film, or working for the aircraft manufacturer, or for it was a time. The 50s and 60s were a time when America was in motion and people were in motion.
So maybe the first generation where there's this transitory kind of expected apartment chapter of life,
right,
between living in mom and dad's house and then either inheriting it, or when people lived less time, inheriting it or moving into your own place. That was not, that's an expected decade of American life now. But that's a fairly modern invention.
Sure, you would have been married at 20 at any time prior. You didn't, or the vast majority of people didn't spend their 20s just gadding about, right? Working a series of whatever jobs and
bopping from apartment to apartment as rent changed.
Making out with as many people as you can, or in your case, getting married, right out of college to your sweetheart.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely don't want to do it in that order. You don't want to get married and then make out with as many people as you can.
Well, depends on who you are. Depends on who you know. But
If you've
also,
got all the shag carpeting and water beds, maybe you can get away with it.
this was the time when the highways and American cars, that whole world all came to fruition. We'd been building highways across America for 50 years at that point, but it finally all clicked, right? You could drive from Boston to San Francisco in just one uninterrupted stretch of road. You know, you get on Highway 40 and go all the way across the country.
I wonder if it took decades for the psychological effect of that to become clear, you know, or if people are immediately like, oh boy, we could drive to the other ocean, or if it probably took a new generation to do that.
In the 30s, there was the sort of dawn of that realization, and the roads were being connected and the cars were capable of that kind of travel. But it was also the Great Depression. It wasn't a widespread. No one had the Okies made their way out to California in their wagon trains of Model A's.
But they lived in government camps. I've seen Grapes of Wrath.
Yeah, that's right. They sure did. They all had mice in their pockets.
They were just picking peaches.
But it wasn't until after the war, when you had money, you had the brand new cars and all these wonderful roads, and there became an part of the mid-century vernacular was targeted at the people in cars that were newly making their way around not just the city or the state, but the country. People going on trips to just go on trips, to be in cars. And
are you talking about motels, or are you talking about longer term residential?
I'm talking about a vernacular of mid-century architecture that revolved around cars and car access. And it took the form of a sense of design, a design style that predominated in businesses that catered to cars. Gas stations, motels, coffee shops, donut houses.
People bringing me a hamburger on roller skates.
That's right. And so these buildings took shape partly as advertising signs. The shape of the building and the style of the decorative elements and incorporating the sign into the building.
You still see it in LA.
You do a lot in LA.
Where even though rents are still up, whole swaths of it have not been plowed under like it has here. So you can still see a donut shop with a big giant donut on the sign, right, or just an amazing looking old burger dive that has looked like that since the early 50s.
And some of that is because there was so much of it, because LA grew so rapidly during that time and cars were such a big part of it that, LA has only recently started to appreciate this architecture as being significant enough to save. And a lot of the great examples of it were torn down just in the last 15 years by people that wanted to replace it with something stupid. Which is kind of always the case. Just when you start to realize that a thing is beautiful, that's when it's at its greatest threat.
I wonder if the need for movie and TV production to preserve this stuff has actually moved the needle at all, you know? But maybe they're okay with just 5 of those cool old-timey diners, because you see them over and over again.
Yeah.
The really good ones, the really good motels you'll see in every TV show. But there's a need for them.
There is, and also in LA, there's an whole industry of people that are hyper conscious of style, hyper conscious of just like every aspect of consumerism,
and with an emphasis on camp and kitsch, because it's a town of pop culture where a lot of people work in recent leaning design fields, a vibrant queer culture, which helps.
Right.
It's a city that's going to appreciate that stuff on a different level.
And that was true even in the time that these things were being designed and built.
They knew the big donut was funny.
They did, and what you see in this architecture is that this was a time. Let's set an arbitrary date of 1953. It was post nuclear bomb, post war, and the war, World War II, and the dawn of the jet age. It produced a lot of styling cues in the form of just what was expedient in terms of making airplanes fly faster and all the way the weaponry became more and more streamlined as a way of making it more functional as a war machine.
You're talking about there's almost an aerodynamic styling to some of these buildings.
There absolutely is. The whole notion of aerodynamic design, which was trying to get more and more fuel efficiency out of a B-17,
makes no sense for a building, which isn't going anywhere.
Or really, a 57 Chevy doesn't really need fins in that same way.
I don't know. Maybe each fin bumps up your gas mileage by 0.001 gallon.
Right. Keeps that the wind shear off of the wear off the tires. But so you see this kind of grab bag of styling cues that revolve around the kind of clip art of an atom with a little central ball and some spinning electrons around the outside of it.
It's funny. It's a weird take on science. Science is cute.
Science is cute. You've got boomerang shapes and parallelograms, but are kind of soft, like organic looking, but also boomerangs being a kind of emblem that looks aerodynamic and futuristic.
Neon lends itself to cursive, so you get more kind of curves and ribbons in even the typography.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I can see it.
Plus, all of the people coming back from the South Pacific, you introduce tiki culture and Hawaiian culture into it, so you suddenly have, in addition to the nuclear aerospace stuff, then you have on top of that a kind of Polynesian culture, but also you've got people coming back from France, and so you introduce sort of Riviera nomenclature and style, and then Florida also playing a major role, Florida and Cuba being places, the kind of the playgrounds of this era. You get the flamingos and the Ricky Ricardo kind of like Caribbean vibes.
I guess I'd never really thought about how much the jet age just ended default American isolationism.
Yeah.
Like, we build stuff this way because why not? We're 3,000 miles from anybody doing it differently. But now that everybody's seen the Caribbean, the South Pacific, a lot of them served in Europe, they can all go back to those places with their families. Suddenly you're going to have more cross-pollination of everything, and that includes design.
And the very top level of all that stuff really lent itself to kitsch. To understand what Polynesian art is and represents and what that stuff is, it would be kind of like impossible for a serviceman to bring back with his Aloha shirt. But he could bring a little tiki doll and sit it up on the mantle, and everybody, kitsch incorporates, and kitsch consumes everything and spits it out the other side, transformed. And all these buildings that got built during this period were basically a giant waving hand saying, pull in, get off the highway, come in, check it out, coffee shop. And if you think about what those buildings looked like in their initial context, surrounded by architecture that was not doing that work at all.
Yeah, the equivalent, I guess, earlier in cities would have been shop windows for the pedestrian. Like, everything's going on inside. The purpose of the shop is to let you see what the new items are and to lure people in that way.
A mannequin.
And that cannot happen from a car. You're going to be going by too fast to see, are those the new dresses? Or, hey, those toys, that toy railroad looks fun, or whatever it is. They've got telescopes there. From a car, you just need
a 40-foot tall rotating
a big
donut,
shape, a big sign,
right? Or a jet airplane on top of and it says, "This is new. This is for you." And this vernacular ended up being kind of all brought together under the rubric Googie architecture. And Googie,
what does that even mean?
In LA, there was a diner called Googie's, Googies.
Yeah, it's a woman's nickname, I think. There's an actress named Googie.
Yeah, it was the nickname of the mother or the wife of the founder of Googie's, and it was done in in this kind of like space age modern attention-grabbing, multicolored LA diner architecture, and it was just so. It's only called Googie architecture because an art critic driving past saw it and said, that stands in for all of this style. It could just as easily be called Norm's architecture.
Well, something about the word Googie with those round G's and O's and the kind of the funny, the goofy sound of it, because it sounds like words like doodad and goof. I think Googie as a name is often a name for Georgette.
Yeah, right, or Georgia.
But a cute one.
But the thing about Googie architecture is that although if you put it next to the great mid-century architecture, the sort of, the Richard Neutra buildings, the austere glass sort of paragons of this style. If you put those next to Googie buildings, you can see a through line in the sense that they're both very modern and they both are derived from elements of what would have been Deco architecture, but their philosophies are extremely different. And that high art mid-century without adornment, if you compare it to Googie architecture, which is all about adornment, and Googie architecture also uses a lot of shapes that, the flat roofs, the parallelograms, the vaulted ceilings, the some of the stuff that's used across the whole spectrum of mid-century design.
But there's also eye-catching, golden arches.
Right.
It's come down to us as kind of a fast food-looking architecture.
And golden arches, I mean, the earliest McDonald's are fundamentally Googie architecture. And Googie architecture took over all the place. If you think about the Las Vegas sign, welcome to Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Classic Googie architecture. And what you saw on those, they often had these graphic atoms, boomerangs, often an exploding star.
Yeah.
And the star is basically just a nuke going off, where it's
Oh, you think this is sublimated suburbanite fear of the atom?
Or celebration of it. I mean, we're terrified of the atom, but we also feel like we're in charge of it now. Like we've mastered it, and at its worst, it's going to rain apocalypse down on us. But at best, we have free energy, and
I always think it looks more like a sunburst when I see those styles.
And that's what they're called. They're called sun. You see them in clocks of the time, sunburst or starburst clocks. But it's
yeah, I guess
it's also
it's a very modern man-made take on the sun.
Yeah,
it's easy to draw the line to the atom bomb.
An airburst explosion.
Yeah,
but all of that stuff is hyper adornment based, because even at its best, Googie architecture is kind of inspirational architecture. But you start to see uninspired buildings, but with Googie appliques.
I mean, you see this now. Apartment buildings that are trying to put a fresh face will often put on Googie style new logos with a little boomerang or whatever that kind of paint palette shape is.
And actually, paint palettes were used as a design element in a lot of this stuff.
Is that what that is?
Yeah,
I always wonder that curved thing.
A curved thing with a little thumb hole in it. You see that all the time in Googie architecture.
And so now it's become a way of kind of making a very unstylish building at least look we can't make it not look old, but maybe we can make it look old in a cool way to the untrained eye.
Well, what's funny about a lot of those that you're seeing is that those aren't late edition pasted up attempts to make those buildings look good. Those design elements were built with the building. They were the only style those buildings ever had. And that's what we're going to talk about today, which is the Dingbat apartment building. And when you think about the word Dingbat, we use it a lot as a synonym for dummy or yo-yo, goofball.
It's a Edith Bunker, right?
Yeah,
but it seems like an old-timeier word than that.
Well, and it is an old-timeier word, and I think its other use, which is as a typographic word, a term for any kind of graphic element within a text or on the side of a text. We see them. The dingbat that's most familiar to us now are emojis, but in old typography, dingbats were all the kind of decorative little asterisks and
I feel like I didn't see that until home desktop publishing became possible in the early 90s. Does the word dingbat really predate that, or
it does,
or is it's not a home computer era word?
No, home computers threw dingbats up in our faces in the worst possible way.
But in the world of typography, I wonder where the word comes from first. I think it looks like it meant dummy first.
It's confusing, but actually it started as a typographical term.
Oh, really?
In the early 20th century.
But somehow it sounds like it means dummy, so it got borrowed for that.
Yeah, dingbat. I mean, whether or not it's just a onomatopoeia or not.
I wonder if ding dong or something like that already meant dummy. So dingbat, the typographical term, got borrowed.
But dingbat it did become kind of universal with the advent of Unicode. That you could now put any one of these million little symbols, X's and crosses and circles and stars, snowflakes and whatnot. But no, it was part of the book printing. In a way, it's like a modern version of an illuminated manuscript. All the stuff that you would kind of put, the filigree that you'd put around a text, could all be described as dingbats.
Not punctuation, or at least not common punctuation.
No, but decorative stuff and you see it on a page of poetry where the publisher obviously feels like you need to fill up some of that blank space around the text with some other stuff. And dingbat architecture, as I describe it, I think everyone in America will recognize what I'm talking about. And I believe that, and in Canada too, because dingbat apartments are very, very, they're a major part of the Vancouver, Canada architecture, so much so that Vancouver even has their own version of it.
Another city that grew about the same time.
Right. But a dingbat apartment is one where the bottom floor, the ground floor, is just parking. And the building appears to sit on stilts floating above the street. The building is essentially a lot line building, meaning that it goes right to the end of the lot in every dimension, 50 feet wide by 100 feet long.
It's as big as it can be,
right,
for that price.
There's no appreciable yard. And then the buildings themselves are 2 or 3 stories tall. The front can have windows, but not necessarily. And as far as you can tell from the street, there's no discernible front door. The front door to the building is concealed. Kind of what you see from the street is just the taillights of a bunch of cars.
Do the multiple units each have their own exterior entrances, but they're on the side or back? Is that right? Or
yeah. So one of the selling points of it to this generation of people who had never lived in apartments before was that each apartment in a dingbat building would have its own separate entrance, rather than, I think, for the generation prior that were living in boarding houses, rooming houses.
You'd have to walk through a hallway. There's a common telephone, maybe common bathroom facilities. You have to see and smell your neighbors cooking.
A lobby.
Less of that here. Less common area. It's better for the TV era. Isolation. You're the only one in your car, and you're the only one in your house.
Right, and you get the feeling, even though you're sharing walls with other people, you get the feeling of autonomy, of your own This is your own little fiefdom. And that was part of, and you had your own parking space.
Yeah, your car has its own little fiefdom too. It's when you look at the pictures of these places, it's funny how centered it is on the cars having little fun nooks.
Yeah.
This is where you put the car. It's almost like you're putting your shoes in a cubby. Here's where you put the car away. Now we all go into our houses.
And what's crazy is that after these apartments were, after they were largely built, or largely after they were built, the size of American cars kept growing and growing and growing, so that an apartment building that was built in 1959, there was hardly room in those spots for a 1974 Chrysler Imperial. And it's very hard to park in those structures, I can tell you. I've dented more than one fender kind of trying to reverse out of a building that's built up to its lot line. But these buildings were cheap to build and were...
what's the advantage of them? Is it primarily just that they're the cheapest possible thing, or is it like, are they enough cookie cutter that once they started to catch on, that was just the easiest way to get plans?
It is that you could put the most number of people into the square footage of your lot without exceeding zoning in terms of height, or
is the limitation on zoning, is it height? Is the limitation on height here, is it zoning or is it building materials? It's
zoning mostly, and
that's why they're all generally 2 stories above a...
Yeah. And we watch as zoning changed to respond to dingbat apartments, because I think even in the time, zoners and city planners were taken by surprise as these dingbat apartments kind of swept through. I mean, there are whole neighborhoods in LA where these were not, these weren't the original buildings. Buildings were getting torn down, old houses, bungalows getting torn down and replaced by these so quickly that the cities didn't respond.
If the city had it all to do over again, maybe they would have allowed higher height limits and actually had, real apartment buildings, more density.
Yeah. And I don't think at this point in time, I mean, LA had sealed its fate in choosing to design itself around the automobile. Mm-hmm. Certainly in Seattle, the response to these buildings was decades long and remains like philosophically an attempt to get cars out of the picture. I mean, one of the worst things about these is that they don't contribute at all to street life. You can't come sit on the stoop and talk to your friend. There is
no stoop.
So what happens
there is only
is
garage.
The sidewalk itself becomes an impoverished desert, because walking through these neighborhoods, all you're looking at is the bumpers of cars. You never see another person. There's no reason to ever pull up and stop and talk.
Mindy's house hunting pet peeve is private homes where no attempt has been made to conceal garage.
Right.
A 3-car garage is so huge in a place, if you live any place where everything's built around the automobile, that, places often you have a facade that just looks like a fire station, because it looks like a little house has been perched kind of above and behind 3 giant garage doors.
Right. And then I guess front door in between them or something.
Yeah. And it's Dingbat apartments that kind of made that look palatable. Like, well, of course, you drive up to this house. What else are you going to do?
Right. You drive in and no one ever, your feet never touch the ground. You never breathe outside air. The buildings all, in order to distinguish themselves from one another, the reason they're called Dingbat apartments is that it was very common, almost universal, that they would be adorned on the outside with some little dingbat, a star, a boomerang, a triangle of some kind, an exploding...
just one of these little curly Q asterisk symbol things.
Right. Or tiki lamps, or a tiki statue, or a flamingo, or a Polynesian... graphic element. And they all had exotic names like Casabella, La Traviata, the Flamingo. They were in some ways a total betrayal of the philosophical version of mid-century architecture as transformation of society, because they were poorly crafted, very inside, like there's no connection to the outdoors. There are no windows that look out onto a verdant green. It's just about it's the birth of the McMansion mentality, which is my lot is 7,000 square feet.
How big can the box be?
Yeah, can I put a 6,900 square foot house on it, leaving enough room on either side to walk around?
It's just when people start to fetishize square footage as what they look at in the listing.
But you can get, as a working class person, a 2-bedroom apartment, at least at the time, somewhat affordably. Now in LA, to rent an apartment in a dingbat is not especially cheaper than to rent an apartment in a Spanish, a Spanish colonial
little bungalow. Or is there any premium to the fact that these buildings now kind of look cool and campy and old?
Well, so what my most recent encounter with the Dingbat apartment was when I went to Los Angeles with you last year to watch your goat triumph, and I was there with my friend Jessie. And after the show, she and I went on a long walk through central LA, just kind of, I think we were headed to Katz's Deli, another place with Googie architecture.
You probably saw a lot of people walking through LA with you.
Yeah, so many people out on the streets.
Out giving you a wave after their little promenade at the end of the day.
In fact, you do see a lot of people walking in LA on Friday and Saturday nights because they're in central LA there's a very large Orthodox Jewish community.
Oh, interesting.
And so late at night, I often, will be walking along kind of the only person walking. And then all of a sudden, the streets are full of people because Temple just got out.
You're the only Gentile walking.
And there are all these families, they're having a wonderful time. And it's some of my favorite times in LA because all of a sudden, you're greeting people and it's this wonderful sidewalk life. But on this particular walk, she and I were walking block after block after block past dingbat apartment after dingbat apartment. We never saw a front door and these are nice neighborhoods. They're central. It's West Hollywood. I mean, in
LA, you can mask a lot of it with nice landscaping because, a lot of beautiful looking and smelling stuff grows there. It's a nice place to walk in the evening.
But even here, because they're these lot line constructions, it's just driveway,
No
driveway.
room.
No room even for a palm tree. And over time, I was just struck by, like, what is this? It's the worst architecture you could possibly. You couldn't come up with a thing that was more alienating, either for pedestrians or for the people that live there themselves.
Cars. Once again, cars.
And I've spent, back in the days when all of the pot dealers in Seattle lived in these buildings, you spend enough time in them to realize that they're not inviting. They're just places to habitate. Did you see the movie The Slums of Beverly Hills? Natasha
Lyonne, yeah, but maybe not since it came out.
And the whole premise of that is that her father was down and out, but kept moving from dingbat apartment to dingbat apartment within the Beverly Hills school district.
Oh, right.
In order to keep
her in the schools,
keep that address. But that movie kind of exemplified the tone and timbre of living in these dingbats.
Are they kept up nice on the inside now?
Well, so
I've never been in one.
We're living in a world now where the camp and the mid-century retro revival, you run out pretty quickly unless you live in Palm Springs. You run out pretty quickly of perfectly maintained and architecturally prominent places to restore. And those are not in everyone's price range. And there's been lately a movement called mid-century modest, which is a lot of people kind of appreciating the more modest sort of Levittown version of mid-century architecture that was built early enough that it was still built well. Before everything became sort of stucco and staples. There were, that first iteration of it still had oak floors. Those buildings were often designed by architects at the beginning of their careers. And that mid-century modest thing is kind of keeping an appreciation of the era accessible to people. But in LA, there's now a dawning appreciation. First, Googie architecture is starting to be protected because some of those structures are among the best of 20th century. I think you would say design more than anything else, but architecture as a component of design.
It's funny today because pastiches of that style are everywhere in these kind of fake roadside diners,
right?
But and they look kind of awful,
right?
But for some reason, the authentic ones, maybe just because we know they're really they're true, they're from the period. It just can't be recaptured.
Well, because there is proportion in those, right? The ones that are fake, like everything fake, what's lost is
it's just slapped on
proportion and the extra expense that it takes to make the Corinthian column look right from a distance. And that's not a mid-century reference. There aren't hopefully Corinthian columns in them. Although later, like the sort of Hollywood Regency version of mid-century architecture became all about Liberace level of decorative elements. But there are now people that want to start preserving these dingbats. And to my eye, there's still nothing there to save.
Well, I have a question, and we have not brought this up. LA is an earthquake-prone part of the world. Mm. I mean, have you looked into what happens to dingbat apartments during a quake?
So
they're called soft story because they have one particular part of the building that collapses much easier than the rest.
In the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California, the vast majority of buildings that were destroyed were dingbats because of the soft story thing that you describe.
And you can see pictures where the whole apartment just lands on the cars like the Wicked Witch of the West.
And what it is that that in an earthquake in particular, like you have a lot of lateral shear forces that happen. Mm. Buildings are shaking off of their axis,
side to side,
and those lower stories are without any sort of shear bearing weight.
It's just posts.
They're just on posts. Yeah. Those buildings collapsed in such proliferation that San Francisco in 2013 imposed a new ordinance insisting that all these dingbats undergo seismic retrofitting.
And adding shear walls to the lower
not
level,
shear walls, but you would need to put in new bracing to kind of effectively shore them up so that in the event of an earthquake. And then LA saw San Francisco kind of pull this off, and in 2016, LA rolled out what would be a gradual set of new regulations that would, starting with the highest capacity dingbats, the ones that were 3 stories tall that had 12 or 16 apartments, and then working over time, a gradual rollout that these dingbats would have to undergo retrofitting. But of course, in LA, in San Francisco, both, the number of these buildings makes that somewhat impossible task to retrofit them all.
It looks like LA has something as maybe over 10,000, something on the order of 10,000 of these buildings that would need retrofitting.
Yeah. And not every property owner has the wherewithal to seismically retrofit their, effectively their slum building. It's true all the way up the coast. We have them here in Seattle. In Vancouver, there's a version. There are a lot of dingbat apartments, but there's a version of it called the Vancouver Special, which has a sort of a very shallow peak roof to it. And in Vancouver, there are so many Vancouver Specials that it became a zoning problem and a cultural problem in Vancouver. And those too are very susceptible to earthquake damage. And all of these cities on the West Coast are just waiting for the big one.
It's going to happen.
Right? And when it does...
the show will be over.
I don't think that even your seismic retrofitting is going to compensate for the fact that these buildings are made out of stucco and cardboard for the most part. these buildings weren't confined to the West Coast. In fact, there's a version of this architecture that you could describe as Atlantic City architecture. On the East Coast and in New Jersey, it's called doo-wop architecture.
Oh, that's funny.
And many of those New Jersey vacation towns, beach towns, have as much or more googie architecture and dingbats as any kind of West Coast coastal town. And then it's also really a major feature of South Florida.
Yeah, I was going to say Florida. I guess it's any place where car accessed stuff was growing really fast during that decade.
And there was a lot of fascination with the space age and
Florida.
And the googie stuff maybe didn't even hit its apex until the space race began. If you think about the Seattle World's Fair and the New York World's Fair, they're built almost entirely in that vernacular. The Seattle Center has, the Space Needle is nothing if not a googie
Seattle was
building.
smarter than LA because we didn't build our airport in that style.
Right.
we were like, we'll put the Jetsons looking thing here where the tourists are, but we're not going to tear down the airport.
But JFK Airport and
Yep.
and LAX and SeaTac, the kind of SeaTac in its second incarnation was pretty darn space age. But you see the remnants of it, and I think cities recognized that they needed to preserve these major buildings. But now it's starting to filter down to even the worst dingbats. There were a couple of dingbats that were sort of ironically restored. One of them famously...
Here or in LA?
In LA. One of them famously called the Crappy Apartments.
I assume they changed the name.
A transposition from Capri to Crappy with an I. And, these are hipsters restoring these buildings. There's one called the Cheesy Apartments.
This is irony taken as far as you can go. I can see buying a funny lunchbox or a funny jacket from the thrift store. But when you're actually buying funny real estate or putting your name on a funny lease, that's a little bit too far.
It's hard to envision a time because there are zoning laws in effect places where these buildings have been singled out as things that the city is going to encourage developers to tear down and replace. And speaking as someone who looks at what developers are building these days, which are even in some ways worse, I can't imagine how much hatred there must be for dingbats to say, no, tear this down and build your mock craftsman.
Build your big Rubik, whatever that big Rubik's Cube thing is.
Yeah. But there are so many of them, I can't imagine ever feeling like they were, that they were something to be preserved. But of course, that's what
you always think.
That's what you would have said about those bungalows.
There's going to be plenty of bowling alleys forever. We don't have to worry about those.
Well, and bowling alley is another classic example of googie architecture, right?
Yep.
And they're all gone now, every last one. So we may live to see a time when the crappy apartments are on a postage stamp.
And that concludes Dingbat Apartments. Entry 351.AC2830, certificate number 25380 in the omnibus. Another relic getting torn down everywhere right now is social media platforms. But John and I are going to stick it out. We are still on Facebook in the form of our Futurelings fan group.
Oof.
The only way to be on Facebook, in my opinion. You can find us on Twitter as @JohnRoderick and @Ken Jennings. John is on Instagram as well. We are at Omnibus Project jointly on many of these platforms. We can be sent physical items through the United States mail to P.O. Box 55744, Shoreline, Washington, 98155. I guess I still have some mail here to open. I don't know.
Yes.
I don't know what's in all these things.
Anything good?
It's not scented.
Okay, so it's not to me then.
Woo! Sarah sent us I wonder what the era of this is. Some kind of mid-20th century advertisement for the Seattle's famous Curiosity Shop on the waterfront downtown.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think the era of this advertisement is? From the typography, it could be anywhere from the 30s to the 60s.
Well, from the cardstock, we know that it's from a time when this cardstock was ever used. I think this
Good
is
point. Well, that's very true.
I think this is from the 1970s. I'm going to say this is from 1978.
That late.
Yeah, because this version of
It's trying to look old-timey.
the old-timey, I feel like it hit its point around Seattle in about 78.
I'm opening a box now of very,
It's cool, though.
very well padded stuff from I don't know who. Is there a note?
Oh, are those sea glass floats? What are those?
I don't know what else they could be unless it's some kind of bong without an opening.
Oh, yeah, I think that these are hand-blown Japanese fishing floats. That's my guess.
Did somebody
Look at that.
warn you they were going to send you this?
No, I just was talking about these to somebody the other day. These used to wash up on the beaches in the Pacific Northwest a lot. These are used by Japanese fishermen to keep their nets afloat back before plastic. They're hand-blown glass. Although that one over there, the one next to you, looks like it's cast. What is that? Is that a crack? Or is that a casting line?
That is a casting line. And the top is kind of dented, though, so this one didn't come out great, but I guess it floats.
Floats. That's all it needed. They used to, they would get, their stuff would get caught in storms, and then these glass balls would just float all the way across the Pacific Ocean.
Well, if you
They're
want to
cool.
if you want to make bongs out of those,
There's no note that came with them? They just sent two glass balls?
I feel like the address is of another correspondent.
Dear Ken and John, here are 2 glass balls.
One for each of us. That was very thoughtful. Oh no, here it is. There is a note. Finally. And it's from Dawn again, who sent you the the little locking miniature book bank recently.
My friend Dawn.
While clearing out my house, I set these aside for you too. So they are indeed glass floats from fishing nets, I guess.
The Japanese floats.
And she says that growing up in the Pacific Northwest, these seem to be found in 1 in every 5 homes, usually contained in some sort of macrame holder.
True.
I don't remember these as decor.
Really?
No. I can see it, though.
There are little ones, there are big ones, and that macrame holder, I think, is meant to imitate the sort of woven net that they would have supported in the ocean.
Well, plus macrame would have beads in it, too. So my aunt was the master at finding these on the beach with a couple at her house the size of watermelons.
Yeah.
I have never seen those.
Oh, back in the day when you found them on the beach, I bet if you lived out on the coast, you would still find them on the beach.
Hope you enjoy, and if not, you should get a pretty penny for them.
So what?
These are collectible floats. Now you're interested. You're like, well, how many pretty pennies? I like it, but do I like $40 more? These are really nice, though. Thank you so much, Dawn. You could send us virtual items. It's much simpler. You can just use the omnibusproject@gmail.com if you have access to electronic email. Electronic email? That's my favorite kind.
Electronic email.
If you have electronic email in your chronological period, you can always support Omnibus financially at patreon.com/omnibusproject. In fact, this very entry about Dingbat apartments, which is right up your alley, was suggested by a listener named Jeremy, who thought it would make for a great omnibus and was right. Thank you, Jeremy, for supporting the show. And that's one of the higher levels of perks, is you get to actually recommend some possible show topics for us to curate. But even for a pittance, for $5 a month, John, you can receive a bonus episode.
Who, me?
You could.
Really?
I mean, you've probably already heard the bonus episode this month because you're on it.
But if I gave you $5,
I would let you listen to it again.
Month. Okay.
And if you gave me $10 a month, I'd let you see the video feed of images on the Patreon.
What?
And for a mere $20 a month, I would send you a signed copy of Omnibus Show Notes with your own signature on it.
Cool.
It's pretty great.
Do you ever put pictures of me up on the internet?
Yes. But I would prefer to give no other information about this.
All right. I mean, I'm wearing a cool shirt today.
Do you want a picture of you in your Devo shirt?
My handmade Devo shirt.
What, you made that?
No, I didn't make it, but someone made it.
Well, yeah. I mean, somebody made every shirt. But you're saying that is not... Devo did not get a cent?
Oh, I don't know. That's not what I'm saying. Maybe Devo got a bunch of money for this. I didn't buy it from Devo, though.
I can't tell if you're using your forward-facing camera. Is that a picture of me?
No, I wouldn't take a picture of you and put it on the internet. Problem is, these days, in a T-shirt, I always just look like a guy that works in...
Yeah, you don't
software.
wear T-shirts much.
I don't, no.
Because you like to look a little more put together.
Yeah, but I've started to wear them. I just don't want to look like a software developer.
I don't think you look like a software developer. They have like A, brand new, and B, nerdier T-shirts.
Nerdier than a homemade Devo T-shirt? That's pretty nerdy.
Well, because theirs are going to have like very elaborately designed art with a joke about
a wolf and stuff.
Or Euler. Yeah, or wolves.
Futurelings, from our vantage point in your distant past, we have no idea how long our civilization survived.
Civilization?
Civilization.
Were you Southern for a second?
We hope and pray that the catastrophe we fear may never come. If the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. But if Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.